Welcome, gang, to another module here where I want to discuss some of the weather phenomena that we encounter as airline pilots, and that has to do with wind shears. Certainly, they can apply during takeoffs and initial climbs where they have the potential to be very challenging and even disastrous. I think we encounter them with a lot more potential for a need to know the information systems that are available to us now to help us during approaches. Approaches, in my opinion, are the most critical area to be able to address, and that's what I want to do in this next module. I go back in time where we didn't have any of this information. A lot of what we have available to us today in knowledge and equipment is a result of some of the disastrous conditions that we had back in the 70s, especially where we started to have some pretty significant incidences that required science and technology and manufacturers to come up with some kind of systems to assist us, as well as the knowledge, the brain and academic knowledge of how these systems operated. But from a personal standpoint, the one thing that I would like to cover at this point as an introduction going into some of the modular information that I want to share with you, in my flying career, as an airline pilot, I can recall two very significant events back in the time when we didn't have these systems and knowledge. And if you have any encounters with wind shears in your flying career, you will learn to respect them a lot more than you have without having experience. But I'll tell you, once you get into some experience levels with some of these, and if they're very significant, you'll always be on your toes in these kinds of conditions where you, first of all, will maybe consider not taking a chance to encounter them. I'm going to talk about some details about that, especially with some of the approach information that we have available to us, because that's always an option. Don't go challenge it. One of the great things in a flying career to come up with as a philosophy is don't go into conditions that's going to challenge your ability to handle it mentally, with the human factors involved and the skill factor that's going to be involved to be able to operate through it. The more prudent approach is back off, be humble about some of these circumstances, and I'll talk about that in more detail. And that's especially applicable on approaches. I will share with you two incidences that occurred that were a real eye-opener for me. And these were in times before we had some of this equipment. I recall a number of times in approaches into Atlanta, and Atlanta seems to be an airport that very often can have conditions of wind that are pretty challenging. But I can remember a couple times on approaches before we knew any of this, and we just really had nothing on our mind but get a passenger from point A to point B, regardless of what you had to deal with. And before we made some prudent decisions about not even dealing with this stuff. One of those incidents is when I happened to be flying as a first officer. This was back in the 727 days, going into Atlanta, making an approach to the east in some weather conditions that I don't even know if we were advised anything about wind shear, because back then they never really kind of advised you of any wind shear, because I don't think they had the technical know-how to be able to measure what winds were around an airport other than what was prevailing that they gave you out of the tower. But in any case, I can remember this one particular approach where you're making an approach, and as you look at this picture here, I can recall that we were in a portion of a wind shear where it was really taking us down off the glide path and consequently pushing the power up and trying to make the airplane climb. It didn't react the way it normally did, but eventually we kind of had a climb. And then on a very, very short final, maybe within a mile or so, all of a sudden we were in the other part of the wind shear condition where we were trying to get down with power back at idle, well above the glide slope, the nose pointed probably 10 degrees or more down to try and get down to the runway to land, and floating beyond the threshold, beyond the landing zone, and landing well down the runway with a pretty exciting few minutes where the obvious objective was to get the airplane on the runway, and we had no knowledge about these kinds of conditions. And that was just one incident that I can remember the captain and I talking about this after, about how lucky we were. And lucky is kind of a relatively mild word for it. The other time, I remember one time on an approach, we were pretty much at 3,000 feet approaching the airport in Knoxville, and you could see that there was a thunderstorm out to the west. It seemed to be well off the airport property, and we were planning on making an approach at the airport. Were relatively benign. As we descended through 2,500 feet, and that was somewhere about 10, 12 miles from turning on to the approach, all of a sudden we got in a wind shear that took us down 1,500 feet. Keep in mind that I said 2,500 feet. This about 15 miles from the airport just took us down to an altitude that was somewhere around 1,200 feet or so. I'll tell you, there was no way that we had any opportunity to control that aircraft at that point. The officer was flying in this particular situation. He did a fantastic job of flying that airplane when we got into that condition. I mean, it happened so suddenly and it's so quick that when you have these conditions that are thrust upon you, when you have no knowledge them occurring or not having enough knowledge to know better than to even get in the proximity of some of these conditions, that was a case in that particular situation. So I'm lead in with that here, gang, because there's a whole area of wind shears that we deal with. You know, it doesn't make any difference if you deal with them at higher altitudes, but we're talking about dealing with them here close to the ground. And even with the sophisticated gear that we have to be able to help us in these conditions, you're going to have to deal with it close to the ground. I'm going to try to cover in a lot of detail so that you can understand how these systems operate and what they give you. It's still pretty dicey. So I want to cover this in detail because I think one of the things I found in my career, and also when I was involved in training, most pilots do not fully understand the wind shear guidance system, how it operates, and what it actually gives you, depending on the conditions of the operation. So I want to go over that with you because I found in my personal life and in my training as an instructor and as a check airman, most pilots don't fully understand how this system operates. There on the 737, there's really some pretty good information that is available to you to be able to understand the conditions that you're about to enter. That's what's really important. There certainly are great tools for when you're in that condition or you're handling your aircraft through some of those conditions and how those dynamic conditions are changing with each mile that you fly on an approach. But there is some important information that most of us don't take advantage of that's available to you to keep you fully informed on an approach, what you're dealing with at the moment and what you're about to head into. Because what's really important is knowing what's ahead of you as you get closer and closer to the ground. So we're going to go over some of those things as we address this module. I see right now that we're pretty close to 12 minutes. I'm going to segment these modules on the approach. This is just kind of introductory. I hope it creates some interest in you, that you might be interested in looking at some of the meat and potatoes, the bread and butter that I want to address with you in these future modules. Gang, this is an important area to understand because you don't deal with it every day. You deal with it occasionally. And here's another area where human factor-wise, we don't deal with it. Sometimes we just ignore even learning about it. And that's dangerous. That's really dangerous because in your career, you're going to deal with this stuff. And if you have to deal with it, it's very important to have some good information in your hip pocket, but more importantly, in your mind and in your brain. Anyway, we'll talk about some of that stuff here, gang. I look forward to doing that with you. Look forward to having you participate with any kind of comments or questions or suggestions that would follow up these modules. Okay, God bless and take good care of that little old lady from Pasadena. She's just as important to the safety of how you operate as you are to yourself.